How many of you have ever heard of Charles Spurgeon? Okay. Oh, that's a pleasant surprise. How many of us? He was the Prince of Preachers from the 1800s. He was the pastor of Temple Baptist Church, or Tabernacle Baptist Church. I get those two back. I can't remember. In London, England. At a time when most churches, especially in Europe and England, were pulling dozens to their services, 6,000 were coming to hear Spurgeon preach. Like I said, he was known as the Prince of Preachers and was popular throughout the world, so much so that after his Sunday message was delivered, it was telegraphed across the U.S. to the New York Times, and the New York Times newspaper printed the full text of his sermon from the day before in their Monday newspaper every week. And so he had a tremendous influence. And still, even I read his books, and I think that is a man whose intellect is way beyond mine. But he could share those things in such a way that it just made common sense. That's really where his brilliance was, taking these incredibly hard concepts and explaining them in such a way that even I can understand them. One of his books that he wrote that just has stuck in my mind over the years, just a simple book, The 7 Sayings of Christ from the Cross. But how many of you have ever heard of the unknown primitive Methodist lay preacher? None of us have. His name has even been lost in time. We don't know his name. The story about that was, it was January of 1850. I want to say I even read January 18th, 18th. Yeah, it might not be right. That would be a neat story if it was, because, today's the 18th. But it's January 1850, and there's a major snowstorm, and young Charles said, I want to go to church. And so he was on his way walking to the church he was planning to go to, but the snowstorm was so intense that he just stopped at the first church that he came to. Like I said, it was a primitive Methodist church. That was a type of church. It doesn't mean that they met in a cave and cavemen led the church. That's not what it means. Just primitive Methodist. Today we still have primitive Baptists. So this was a primitive Methodist church. The regular preacher for the church could not show up that Sunday, and so there was a lay preacher. The story has been told that Charles was the only one in attendance that day. I don't think that's quite accurate. I think there were 2 or 3 others that were in attendance, but this lay preacher was given the task of preaching because the preacher could not show up that day because of the snowstorm. It's just too intense. And so this lay preacher stood up and read from Isaiah 45. Call upon the Lord and you will be saved. And Spurgeon, on reflecting on that Sunday, said the preacher, the speaker that day, didn't have much to say, and so he just kept repeating the verse over and over and over and over again. And then he knew enough to explain that Jesus had died for his sins and that he was raised from the dead, and that if you call on the Lord, you'll be saved. And so the preacher just said, young man, you people, will you call upon the Lord? And Charles said, yes, I will call upon the Lord. We meet here as a church of grace, and our history, that we were planted out of Clemson Community Church when Burke and Barbara and a team moved from Clemson to here in 1984. How many of you have ever heard of Burke Wilson? Come on, Burke, raise your hand. You've heard of yourself. How many of you have ever heard of this lady named Lou Ann? And I don't even know her last name. Burke, what's her last name? I'm sorry? Tucson. Lou Ann Tucson. Lou Ann was a young lady. I believe she was 18. Bert can correct my story later. I didn't want to share this beforehand. I wanted it to be off the cuff like this on purpose just to show I don't know the details, but that this young lady has had a profound impact through generations of believers, even to us today. Luann, my understanding is that she was a young lady who was a part of Herschel Martindale's church. If you've heard of Herschel, one of the grandfathers of our faith here at Grace, and 90 years old, still walking with God, still seeing great things happen. But Luann was entering into college, and she did not want to leave where she was fellowshipping, but her parents were insistent that she attend Clemson University. And so she came to Herschel and to Herschel's wife, Mardine, and asked for some advice and counsel as to what to do. And Herschel said, well, if your parents want you to go to Clemson, you need to honor your parents' wishes and go to Clemson. But we won't just leave you alone. We just won't leave you out on your own. So Luann, out of a desire to honor her parents, went to Clemson, but also Herschel and some others wishing to set Luann in an environment where she could grow spiritually, drove from Houston to Clemson. They plastered the campus with tracts, with gospel messages, and just meeting as many people as they could. And over a 3-day period, they met a couple of people, Steve Nelson, that I'm personally friends with now, and Rogers Curvin, and a few others who became friends with Burke down through the years and built into Burke's life. And then here we are, influenced by an 18-year-old young lady who loved God, wanted to have an impact on people. And here I stood until today. I did not even know her last name. I've just heard the stories of Luann. We all want to be influencers. I think it's just something innate. We want to leave our mark. We want to be ones who have made a difference. There are a few of us who just don't care. A few people in, not in this room, but just in culture and society who don't care. But those of us who are followers of Jesus, who have the Spirit of God within us, there is innate in us now a desire to have an influence. And so many of us, we would love to have the influence of Billy Graham, of D.L. Moody, of Charles Spurgeon, of Burke Wilson. We would love to have that kind of influence. But are we also willing to have the kind of influence that is quickly forgotten? That of a Mordecai Ham, or that of an Edward Kimball, or that of just a faithful man of God who did the best that he could in the middle of a snowstorm somewhere, and that was just the best he could do. Or Luann, that we might not even remember her last name. We all want that influence. But when you think of the word influence, wonder what comes to your mind. Do you think Insta-famous? Do you think Instagram influencer? Do you think social media? Do you think that I want to influence for culture? Or are we thinking I want to influence for God? Let's pray and then ask God to show us through the rest of this message what He would have us to know. Lord, thank you. Thank you that you are always working through us. God, because we do have the Spirit of God within us, we want to have an influence on people. An influence for godliness, for good. But, so often we don't know what to do or what to say or how to be or where to go. God, would you take this message today and just give each of us just, what is the next step that we can take to have an influence at our workplace, in our neighborhood, in our apartment building, in our residence hall, in the different classes that we're taking, or around here on campus, and just to have a good understanding that you can use us, and we would rest confidently in how you have made us, and how you're going to use us. In Jesus' name, amen. So if you haven't picked up yet, I'm talking about influence and really becoming a person of influence. Last week, Bert just did a great job of challenging us to speak the gospel, and over the last couple of weeks that hey, we can really make a difference in making disciples. And today, what I am talking to you about is just in the context in which you live. How can you exert and influence with those that God has put into your life, into our individual lives? How can we influence them for good, for God, for godly things? And so let's just talk about what is influence. And influence is this. This is my definition. You can pick it apart, but I figured if I kept it nice and simple, there aren't too many things that can be wrong about it. This is what I think influence is. Influence is persuasion towards a desired outcome. And that desired outcome can be for good, for the things of God, but it also can be things of evil. Influence. There are influencers for evil, as there are influencers for good and godly things. And there are different aspects of influence. I want to begin by one major influencer in the New Testament. His name is the Apostle Paul. And I want to just talk to you, share some verses from 2 Corinthians 10, 13 through 16. But before I read it, I want to give you the context of what's going on. 2 Corinthians 1 through the end of chapter 8 and into 9 is like a victory lap. And then as you start chapter 10, he starts to address those who were tripping people up in the Corinthian fellowship and those who were opposing him. And so the tone changes quite a bit from, you have made me so proud and I'm happy at what God is doing in your life too. There are some here that I'm going to have to speak pretty harshly to change their thinking, because in their opposition, they are opposing the very gospel of God themselves. And so it's in this context that Paul writes these words. He's talking about, and this is what one of the things that he said is, you say that my letters are strong and weighty, but when I show up in person, I'm a weakling and a terrible speaker. He said, if I show up again, I'm going to be in person what I am in my letters. Is that really what you want? And, the obvious implication is Paul saying, come on, guys, just lighten up. We're on the same team here. Let's be together here. But Paul writes these words, and he's writing about his area of influence. And this is 2 Corinthians 10, 13 through 16. But we, Paul and his team, will not boast beyond limits, but will boast only with regard to the area of influence God assigned to us to reach even to you. For we are not overextending ourselves as though we did not reach you, for we were the first to come all the way to you with the gospel of Christ. We do not boast beyond limit in the labors of others, but our hope is that as your faith increases, our area of influence among you may be greatly enlarged, so that we may preach the gospel in lands beyond you without boasting of work already done in another's area of influence. And just a few simple thoughts that I want to come to. In verse 13, where he says, we will not boast beyond limits, but will boast only with regard to the area of influence God assigned to us to reach even to you. We have all been given an area of influence, some more than others, but God assigns our area of influence. So an area of influence that you have is assigned to you by God. So just think about the context in which you live. Again, think of your work context. Think of your classroom context. Think of your neighborhood context or your residence hall context or your apartment building context or your social clubs context or your hobbies or your the things that you just like to do. In that context, God has assigned to each of us an area of influence. And what is influence is persuasion towards a desired outcome. As followers of Jesus, what is our desired outcome is that people would come to know Jesus Christ. Or at least we can move them from being maybe incredibly far from God to being a little closer to God. Or if they're, right on the line and they're ready, we can help them cross over into this is what it is to follow Jesus yourself. Knowing that every person that we come in contact with, we initiate with, we interact with, God is already working at some level in that person's life. So God assigns our area of influence. So just look at yourself. This is where I live. This is the context in which I exist. God, how can you move through me in this context in which I exist, in which I live? Okay, the second thing is out of verse 15. We do not boast beyond limit in the labors of others, but our hope is that as your faith increases, our area of influence among you may be greatly enlarged. We do not boast beyond limit in the labor of others. We don't take the credit for someone else's influence, but rather we rejoice. If someone has a greater influence and a greater area of influence than you have, we have one of two tendencies to respond. And one is to say, well, they're just compromising, and to criticize them. And the other is to just say, well, God, why do they get that? What's wrong with me? Rather, instead, the right response that when someone has a greatly enlarged area of influence, maybe in comparison to my area of influence, how about if we just remember, hey, we're all on the same side, we're all on the same team. I'm so glad he does. Or I'm so glad that she is able to influence people that I could never. That he is able to go places I can never go to. He is able to see people influence for the gospel that I could never have an influence with. Instead of taking what someone else has done and saying, oh, why can't I have more? Or I'm going to take credit for someone else's work, or to come in behind them and when someone has done the hard work and pick up the pieces as if I have been the one that did all the hard work. Paul said, no, we're not doing that. People have their areas of influence, and I think he has in mind guys that we've heard of, like the Apostle Peter and the Apostle John and Thomas and Matthew. And those guys who were doing through them what God is doing, in other places. And Paul is saying, I'm glad of that. But I'm not going to boast in what God's doing through them. Look at what he's doing through us too. And Corinthians, you got me. My team was the one who brought the gospel to you. And so in that I'm going to rejoice. And then in verse 16, so that we may preach the gospel in lands beyond you without boasting of work already done in another's area of influence. And, just as God has assigned our influence, we can pray to God, God, would you increase our area of influence? Because that's what Paul was doing. Say, hey, we came to you with the gospel, and we're looking to go beyond. We're looking at what is the next step. And so you might say, hey, this is the context in which I live. I want an area of greater influence, or I want to have greater influence where I live. God, would you lead? Would you open doors? God, I'm an available servant to you to do whatever you want. But also, don't just look for the flashy things to reveal the area of influence. Just not the flashy things, the great things that many people show up to. But just look, Lord, is there one person that you could use me to influence their life for you today? And tomorrow you might give me 2 or 3 people. Next week you might give me 10 or 12 people. Or next year it might be 10 or 12 people. Or next year it might be one person. But Lord, I just want to be used by you in the area of influence that you've assigned. And God, would you always just be helping me to take the next step and to rejoice when we see you using others in their area of influence. So that's really hitting, I think, at our spirits and our hearts. What is it that we want? Are we looking to make a name for ourselves, or are we looking to truly love people and influence them for God, for godly things, for the gospel, for their benefit? Becoming a person of influence, I just thought of some examples throughout Scripture. The first one that I thought of is Nehemiah. And there's a book named after him. He was cupbearer to the king, and he won influence. He won favor through his work. He was good at what he did, and so that when he was in a position where he was sad one day, instead of the king just saying, "I'm sick of you," the king said, "Hey, this is really unusual, Nehemiah. Something's on your heart. What is it? Nehemiah, you've been a good man for many years, for a long time. You served faithfully. I can see something's on your mind. What is it?" And then Nehemiah just said, "Oh, king, my people are suffering. The walls are torn down." And the king said, "Nehemiah, go and do what you need to do." He won influence over a king just, I think, by showing up to work day after day after day, as well as he was praying. If you read Nehemiah, he was praying. But yeah, I think of David. He learned, he grew when no one was looking. I changed what I wrote a little bit. He learned obedience and faithfulness when no one was looking. But the key phrase is, when no one was looking. What is your life like in private? Because if we think that I can have a godly influence in the context in which I live, but there are secret sins that I am holding on to, God knows those things. And He wants to take those things out of our lives. And I think of David who had influence. He was ready to fight Goliath and killed Goliath. He served the king, Saul, faithfully. Even when Saul became evil and wicked and turned against David, David was faithful to the Lord to continue to serve Saul. And he became king of Israel. And he became the king that it was promised to, that one of his descendants would sit on the throne of Israel forever. And our Savior, Jesus, is known among other titles as the Son of David. But David grew when no one was looking. He was in the field, faithfully caring for his father's sheep, even putting his own life on the line when the bear came, when the lion came. He took care of the sheep when he could have easily have run. And run for his life. And who would have blamed it? His dad probably would have said, "Yeah, that makes sense." But David would say, "No, these are my dad's sheep. I have to do whatever it takes to protect them." No one was looking. And it was also when no one was looking that it is widely believed that many of the Psalms were written. That David saw, especially the shepherding Psalms, were written. And so he's alone in the field just worshiping God. No one was looking. It wasn't for show. But God revealed it. Another man I think of is Daniel. Man of integrity and high office. He was a man of integrity for decades. Came into the Babylonian Empire as a roundabout 13-year-old. And gained influence and gained an ear and became a wise man in Babylonia and served there and served the kings even as number 3 in the kingdom for decades. But he held on to his integrity over the long haul, even when the promise of many riches and many robes were given to him. He held on to his integrity before God. Joseph, Old Testament Joseph. He learned through suffering. He learned to be an influencer through suffering. Rejected by his brothers, thrown in, falsely accused in Egypt, thrown into prison where he was there for 13 years or so. And then he came out and he influenced Pharaoh and influenced the whole nation and never sought revenge and instead sought reconciliation with his brothers. I think of Absalom. One of these is not like the others, by the way. Absalom influenced for evil by just simply showing up. He caused division in the land, caused division against his father David as king. And what he did was he just showed up in the city gate, showed his face, and then started just saying, hey, my father doesn't have time to hear you. Tell me about it. And he just gained influence. And there is a principle that we can learn, that we can gain an influence just by simply showing up consistently day after day after day. In our class, in our work, in our neighborhood, around our residence hall, let your face be shown. And to not just close the door, but to open the door. To walk among other people. To not just eat alone, but to invite others along with you. And just to gain an influence just by showing up. Absalom did it for evil. We can do it for good. The next one is the Apostle Paul. He influenced others through a higher ambition, through an eternal ambition, the gospel. And then Jesus, the greatest influencer of all. As I was putting this list together, I was like, I can't leave Jesus off this list. He influenced the whole world and continues to influence the whole world today more than any other man who has ever lived. And simply because he submitted to his Father. He submitted to his Father and went to the cross and died for our sin and then was raised from the dead. Now, as Jesus, God in human flesh, continues to be worshiped by cultures and generations and nations and people. And we have gathered here to worship Jesus the Christ, the greatest influencer of all. Oh, he's so much more. But among the so much more that he is, the greatest influencer. He is at work right now. And you can rest assured that when you see someone, God use your life to influence someone else, let your first response be, Jesus, thank you for working through me because you're the real influence. You alone are the real influencer. I just get to participate and see some cool things happen from time to time. Hey, let's move on to Matthew 5, 13 through 16. So we've talked here about, just understanding areas of influence. But here's our identity, Matthew 5, 13 through 16. You are the salt of the earth, but as salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Your identity as a follower of Jesus, Jesus gave it. There are other ways to explain our identity, but here he's talking about, our identity is we are salt and we are light. That is just what we are. And so, salt, we just permeate. We make things better. We preserve things. Light brings truth and also just brings comfort and can't be hidden. And so how do we do that? We let our good works shine. That means that we have good works that we let shine. And also, you be who you are. You are salt. You are light. Be who you are. And if you're just a dim light, then, or if you feel like you're just merely a dim light, then get around others who can increase the energy level that will cause the light to shine brighter. Or if you feel like you're salt and I've lost my taste, well, get around other salty people and let their saltiness rub off on you. Good saltiness, that is. And it's this point that I want to make here. Influence is a long road, not a short path. Therefore, do not give up. How many of us have said, I'm going to influence this dorm for Christ or this workplace for Christ? And we pray and we share, and after a week we haven't seen anything. Yeah, I'm moving on. No, influence is a long road, not a short path, so therefore do not give up. I have worked in 2 work environments that were normal work environments. The other, other work environments really haven't, been in and out. It's just been, travel and back, whatever. And but I worked for Westinghouse, a geographic information system subsidiary of Westinghouse, and also worked for a small government contract company. And I say they were normal workplaces because I saw the same people day after day after day after day. And in both instances, over a period of time, I was able to share the gospel with everyone who worked in both places. And God orchestrated both of them. And I just want to tell you quickly the stories behind both of them. When I worked for Westinghouse, I would do things like drive over to Krispy Kreme. I lived in Carborough, but I would leave early. I would drive to Krispy Kreme, get 3 or 4 dozen boxes of hot donuts. I'd turn the heater on. It'd be the middle of the summer. I'd put the donuts in the floor, turn the heater on, try to keep them hot, and I would go and share them with my coworkers. Or I would bring I would pop popcorn and have enough to share around, and I would go to other departments. I had my little station that I worked at, but I would intentionally at breaks, find out when somebody else was taking a break, go sit with them, or I'd walk through other departments and introduce myself or whatever. And then every day I would pray, going in there, God, would you just use me today? But day after day after day, very little would happen. And then month after month, very little would happen. And then there would be a fella I would invite, hey, my church is having a softball game. You want to come play? I was playing. And he said, sure, I'll come along. He got to meet some of those people. And he actually started coming for a while. And I shared the gospel with him and others. And then there was a breakthrough day. Fella came up to me. He was a friend of mine. He was Muslim background. And he just came up to me and said, Ed, why did Mary go to the tomb after Jesus was supposedly crucified? And I'm thinking in my mind, there's no way of sharing that answer without sharing the gospel. And so I started talking to him, and my back was here, he was here, and we talked for about 20 minutes. It was break time. I wasn't on the boss's clock or anything. And I turned around, and everybody in 2 departments had gathered around and were just simply listening to me share the gospel with him. And I had no idea until I turned around and saw that everybody was just taking their break to just listen in. That was a work of God. But I wonder, if I had given up, this prayer thing is not working. This, going to get donuts ever so often, that's just not working. But I was there, might as well just keep praying, keep giving, keep trying, and then just see what God might do. Another time I was working for a small government contract company out in RTP, and same thing, I'd go in every day, except my prayer a little bit with this job was also just desperation because I was in over my head. And so I would pray for all the people, and then I would just be begging God, please just don't let me blow it today. Because I feel like, God, I'm going to be found out today that I don't know what I'm doing. And, so I was praying that day after day after day. And I remember one time sitting in, got there a little bit early. Actually, I think the power was out And so we were just sitting around, and somebody just asked me a question that the only answer was to share the gospel. And then one of the girls who heard that conversation asked me to officiate her wedding ceremony, where every single person in the company came to the wedding, and I took that wedding ceremony to clearly explain the gospel. And so both opportunities, but both a God thing, that I was able to clearly communicate the gospel with every single person that I worked with. You know, could God do something like that? If He did it with me, yeah, He can. It's a no-brainer. He can do it with you, and He will do it with you. So don't give up. And can I share this about, salt and light? The goal is not just to be nice, by the way. The goal is not just to be the nicest person that you and I can be, but to be able to communicate verbally the gospel with people. Okay, moving on. 1 Timothy 4:12 says this, "Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity." You know, be an example to and for others. Okay, so here's my point. Influence is about faithfulness to God more than it is about personality or strengths and weaknesses. So influence is about faithfulness to God more than personality, strengths, and weaknesses. Therefore, we all can be an influencer for godliness. You know, can you set an example? You know, you might think, well, I'm too young. I don't know enough. I haven't been around the block enough. I don't know what to say. But you know how to be an example in speech. You know how to be an example in conduct. In speech, hey, can you set an example in speech and building others up with your speech instead of tearing down? The kind of jokes that you tell. Hey, tell jokes. But let the kind of jokes be that don't tear others down, where they're not coarse joking. Fit for an 8-year-old. Let it be fit for an 18-year-old or a 28-year-old. Conduct. Can you have good conduct? So what do you want to be known for? That's just a question I want to ask you. What do you want to be known for? Do you want to be Insta-famous or a game king or queen? Do you want to be known for your intellect or your athletic prowess or your fashion? What do you want to be known for? Or do you want to be known for your speech, your conduct, your love, your faith, your purity? Hey, and if you're into fashion, there's nothing, that's okay. Keep being in fashion, because that may give opportunities for influence. So hear what I'm saying. If you're into fashion, keep being into fashion. But say, God, would you use this interest in this hobby and this desire that I have to influence others for God? If you're a video king or queen, keep being a video king or queen. But don't let that be what you're known for. Use that opportunity to influence others for godliness, for the gospel. So remember what I said earlier. Influence is built over the long road. It's not a short path. So what can we do to be an example? Make someone else the center of attention. When you come into a crowd, is it incumbent upon you to be the center of attention? Or if you're not the center of attention, do you feel invisible? And that's a game that's never worth keep on playing, but rather make someone else the center of attention. For some of us, we need to lower the volume. For others of us, we need to raise the volume. Learn how to speak appropriately, which means speaking at the right time, which sometimes means I need to settle down and lower the volume. For others, hey, I need to just speak up. And let's avoid silliness, but be quick to laugh. Never laugh at someone else's expense, and always look to build up and don't tear down. I know for some of us, we really will need to think through some of these things here. The last passage I want to talk about is 1 Timothy 5:24 and 25. The sins of some people are conspicuous, going before them to judgment, but the sins of others appear later. So also good works are conspicuous, and even those that are not cannot remain hidden. And this is very close to the previous point, but influence is based on our godliness rather than our giftedness. And I hope that gives you hope. Because you say, I can never be like, and you fill in the blank with a name. Well, you don't have to be, nor should you be. Now, be like them in their faith, in their hope, in their love, in their maturity, in their godliness, in their character, but not in their giftedness to things that cannot be controlled. You are who you are. You are who God made you to be. Be that. It's based on our godliness rather than our giftedness. So integrity. Work to grow in your integrity at work, in class, at home, in your honesty, in the hidden things, as well as the things that are seen, in your godly character. Not seeking to make a name for yourself. In humility, consider others as more insignificant. And the thought there, even why I shared that verse, is that the sins of some are known immediately, but others appear later, and so are good works. Some are known now, but some show themselves later. So again, it goes back to what I said, don't give up, but build your influence, your godly character over time. And the fruit, those good works will not remain hidden. God will make sure they're seen. So here's the therefore from this point. Choose your friends wisely. I think about, the area of influence and the influence that I've had would have never happened if I had had different sets of friends. And I think of some of my closer friends have incredible influence, and I have gotten to enjoy the benefit of that. I'm not boasting in their influence. I'm boasting, God, you've given me some incredible men and women as my closer friends, as my closest companions. I've done things like, recently sitting in a senator's office with a good friend of mine. Would have never happened on my own, but it's on his heart. Hey, I'll go with you. And I think of the places that I've gone, to Greece, to Nepal, to England, to Jordan. Places I would have never gone, just, hey, I'm going to take a joy trip. And then to have shared the gospel in each of those places. It's saying, let's choose our friends wisely. That will make a tremendous difference. So to close up, I'm going to give you 4 things that are here. Becoming a person of influence this week. Okay, I've talked about it a lot, and you might want to go back and read more or hear it again. But here's something you can do, you can implement this week, today. Be A-okay. Hey, just okay is not okay. But you can be A-okay. Acts of kindness. A-okay. Acts of kindness. Get it? It's not original me. I saw it at Faith Walkers. It's like, hey, I like that. But acts of kindness. What are some acts of kindness you could give to people this week? Hey, it might be if you're popping popcorn in your dorm room. Pop 2 bags. Open your door and say, hey, go knock on the door, say, I made some popcorn. Want some? Or, another act of kindness. Hey, what's something I can pray for you? You're sitting in class or you're at work. Hey, I'm going to be praying in a few minutes, because I'm getting ready to eat lunch or whatever. What's something I could pray for you about? So acts of kindness. Number 2, be a giver of gifts. The proverb says a person's gift makes his way before him. Number 3, be quick to listen. Actually, when you listen to someone, Look in their eyes and pay attention to what they're saying instead of formulating your response to what they're saying. That's tough. And that sometimes takes practice, but just start practicing. When they're telling you something, just look them in the eye and listen. And as they keep talking, you might be amazed at how personal they get really quickly. You might be surprised. It might not happen, but hey, pray for it to happen and just see what happens or hear what happens. And then the last thing, be one who speaks up. Just don't remain silent, but speak up. Hey, let me share something with you that changed my life. Can I tell you a story? Can I tell you a story about my life? So be one who speaks up. Take that chance. And if you feel like you don't know where to go, next week during the announcements, ESS was mentioned, the Emerging Servant Summit. It's where we come together. It's our annual disciple-making conference. And for a lot of us who've been doing this for a number of years, who have been seeking, making disciples and doing it, it's an opportunity for us to just come together and say, okay, what's the next step? For some of us, coming to ESS might be the first step. And then just to learn the next step. But for others of us, if you thought, well, I've been many times, I don't know if I'm going to go. Let me just give you this encouraging thought. It's an opportunity to come together and just discover together, well, what might the next step be? We always want to take the next step. The world's not reached for Christ yet. But maybe God can use us to be a part of making it happen. So you want to become a person of influence. I believe you do. The Spirit of Christ in you wants that to happen. So what is something you heard this morning? One or two things that you heard this morning. Jot it down. And even think, who is someone you can share that with? That main point that stuck out to you. Who is someone? Might be someone in here, or it might be a roommate, or it might be a spouse, or it might be a friend, or whatever, that you can share that thought with. And I'll close this off in prayer. Lord, thank you for Jesus Christ, the greatest influencer who has ever lived, who has taken our sin upon himself and has cast them into the deepest part of the sea, it says in the Old Testament, never to be brought again. Our sin, as far as the east is from the west, so are we removed from our sin because of Jesus. And Lord, as we're talking about influencing people and wanting to be an influence for people, it's because we want Jesus to be made known, not ourselves, not even our church name. We want Jesus to be known. So God, would you help us? And each of us are in different places in our maturity, in our personalities, in our giftedness. But God, would you this week just help us to just take one step forward in becoming an influencer for godliness, for the things of you, for Jesus Christ. In Jesus' name, amen.